How far can you transmit on various amateur radio frequencies? In this video, I'll tell you how, but instead of talking about what you can do on a specific frequency, I'll express it in terms of increasing distance. Now, of course, there's different factors as well, like transmit power, your height, terrain, transmitting mode, and other things. So what I'll say now will be very general, and it will vary quite a lot. I should also mention that there are different modes of propagation. Ground wave, where signals go along the ground, is dominant at very low frequencies. In fact, they're extremely low frequencies, lower than what most amateurs use. They get less effective as you go up in frequency. Then there's what you could call direct wave, which is like line of sight, particularly important for VHF, UHF and higher frequencies. Then you've got some extended distance modes like tropospheric propagation, which is particularly dominant, not all the time, but at certain times, especially when you've got a temperature inversion on the VHF, UHF and microwave bands. Then on HF, which is for the longest distance of the lot, ionospheric propagation is very dominant, where the signal bounces up into the ionosphere. It might either directly bounce down to Earth, or it might be refracted within the ionosphere before then going back down to Earth. And there might be several hops, so signals can propagate all over the world with ionospheric propagation. That's just a few of the basics. There's a lot more about all that. I won't go into it in this video, but there are other videos and books that explain all that. But for now, let's get on to the distances. Well, when distances are very small, you'll hear yourself or another station on no matter what frequency. It really doesn't matter, and signals will be strong. Then as you go further away, it becomes less and less likely that you will hear stations. Then there might be cases where you've got in-between distances that you might not be able to hear someone, and then as you go further and further away, their signal comes back again. You can hear them again, maybe even stronger than before. There are different propagation modes and take effect. Anyway, for 1 kilometre, pretty much any frequency will be heard, even at low power. But generally speaking, I'd say the best frequency if you wanted to talk to someone 1 kilometre away would be VHF, UHF, 2 metres or 70 centimetres. You could use a small antenna, not very much power. Even an FM handheld could communicate 1 kilometre unless the obstructions were huge in between them. Then you might have some problems. So yeah, if you've got a friend 1 kilometre away, then VHF, UHF, FM would be fine, even if you've only got handhelds. Now if you go up to 2 kilometres, pretty much the same deal. Noting also that with both the 1 kilometre and 2 kilometre, you'd also hear them on HF and medium frequencies, like 160 metres, without any difficulty. Though you may have difficulties with antenna efficiency down on low frequencies. Even if you go 160 metres, even if you go lower, like 630 metres or 2200 metres, not many amateurs have capability down there, but your antenna efficiency will be very low. But you should still get a 2 kilometre range. There are other considerations like noise in a very high noise environment that can limit your distance, and VHF roughly has less noise than do the lower HF frequencies, so yeah, VHF can offer some benefits there. You've also got on VHF, UHF the scope of a wider bandwidth of signal, so you could then use a mode like FM, a bit broader, maybe a bit nicer sounding than single sideband. Now, if you had very low power handhelds and you're just indoors, then 2 kilometers you might have some problems with. If you're talking to a friend, you might have to get on the roof, and then you probably will be able to work them. Handheld to handheld won't have as much range compared to if one side of you had a mobile station, or even better, a home station with a good antenna. But yeah, 2 kilometers should be easy to do on 2 meters, 70 centimeters FM without any problems, even at fairly low power, like say 1 watt, 5 watts. Go up to 5 kilometers. Again, unless there's big obstructions, that should be easy direct, as they call it, simplex on VHF, UHF. On HF, it's pretty much taken for granted that all your contacts will be direct. And on pretty much any HF band, you should be able to hear someone 5 kilometers away. Although you might struggle on some bands, there might be interference that overwhelms the signal. But overall, if you had 2 people 5 kilometers away, you're probably better off to use a VHF, UHF frequency, 2 meters or 70 centimeters. If you had an antenna set up, then 160 meters or 80 meters would also be fine for a 5 kilometer distance. I should point out that at those sorts of distances on bands like 160 meters, you were looking at ground wave propagation. For VHF, UHF, microwaves direct. Now, with microwaves, an issue there is that you are probably having to use somewhat higher gain antennas, and that means that antennas need to be pointed straight at you. Whereas VHF, UHF, you could use omnidirectional antennas and you'll still hear signals quite strongly at 5 kilometers. 10 kilometers, yeah, 10 kilometers between handhelds, probably not, unless one or both of you were elevated. And it would help if you had a better antenna than the rubber ducky supplied on handhelds. You can buy antenna adapters, so yep, screw in something, maybe a quarter wavelength, maybe a 5/8 or half wavelength on 70 centimeters. Even better, a antenna that is higher, even if it's just a ground plane, but if it's higher than your handheld, if you mounted it, say, gutter height, or maybe even more, like if you were to put up like 5 or 6 meters, an antenna like a ground plane with some coaxial cable plugged into your handheld transceiver on 2 meters, maybe you can get a 10 kilometer distance if there are not too many obstructions in between. If there are, then 10 kilometers might be quite difficult, and then you might need either a bit more power or higher antenna or a bit more gain on VHF, UHF. 10 kilometers would also be if you had 28 megahertz or 10 meter band SSB. You should be able to work 10 kilometers on that, provided your local noise isn't high. And on 3.5, 7 megahertz and 1.8 megahertz, especially on 1.8 and 3.5, and to some extent 7, 10 kilometers is still within your ground wave coverage. For ground wave, you should use a vertical antenna. A horizontal dipole won't be so good for the very close-in stuff. And even on very low frequencies, even though your antenna gain will be very, very negative because you require a physically large antenna to be reasonably efficient, you might still be able to get 10 kilometers on very low frequencies. And yeah, so pretty much any amateur band, someone who's 10 kilometers apart, you should still be able to hear them, though the strength will be greater on some bands than others. When you boost it up to 20 kilometers, some things start to drop off a bit. If you've got a lot of local noise, 3.5 megahertz during the day, you might not be able to hear someone 20 kilometers away. If you're running low power, with 100 watts, you almost certainly would still be able to. For 28 megahertz, 20 kilometers, if you're in a mobile running, say, 10 watts, you might be struggling. If you're at home, had a beam running 100 watts, you'd probably do 20 kilometers. On VHF with a handheld, you'd almost certainly not be able to do 20 kilometers unless you're well located. In fact, it's desirable, but both of you are well located with it. You almost being able to see each other, then you'll do 20 kilometers if you're both on hills, even with quite simple antennas. But otherwise, 20 kilometers is a bit far for a VHF handheld. For a mobile on FM, you're probably struggling on 2 meters and 70 centimeters unless you're driving through a elevated location. If you're using SSB though, 20 kilometers, even if you're running 5 watts to a simple antenna, even a horizontal dipole, SSB is a bit more efficient than FM, so you'd probably still cut through on 2 meters and even 70 centimeters. Microwaves might be a bit hard unless you had some reasonable antennas. So yeah, as you go up in distance, it's actually quite interesting. In fact, I'd recommend it if you're with a friend a few kilometers away. We're talking about 20 kilometers now. Then why not arrange to go various frequencies? Go from whatever band, the lowest band you've got, 160 meters. Go up every single band, even if you don't have an antenna dedicated for that band. If you've got an antenna coupler, then just adjust the antenna coupler so that VSWR is low. Try and load up all sorts of things. And go up all the way in frequencies, all the way up to 70 centimeters, 23 centimeters that you've got it. More people should do it. It's quite interesting. And you might get some cases where you can hear each other on bands you don't expect. Now, if you go up to 50 kilometers, now 50 kilometers sort of distance that is still a ground wave on low frequencies and medium frequencies. Like on 160 meters, provided you didn't have too much noise, you should be able to make a 50 kilometer contact day or night, especially on CW or SSB. AM, maybe not so good unless you've got salt water between you, then that can really help. Now on 3.5 megahertz at night, you should be able to work 50 kilometers. In the daytime, hopefully, if your noise isn't too much, you're probably again better off to have a vertical antenna because it's good for ground wave. But at around that sort of distance, your ground wave isn't so good, and it becomes more of a problem as you go up in higher HF bands. 7 megahertz, you might be able to work 50 kilometers during the day. At night, the band does become noisier, so 50 kilometers at night on 7 megahertz might not be so good. Though it does depend on propagation and the position of the absorption limiting frequency or minimum usable frequency. Anyway, particularly at low sunspot periods, bands like 7 megahertz are very, very poor for shorter distances. But during high sunspot periods, like we're entering, they can be quite good for shorter distances, especially at night. Now, if you keep going up the bands, 14 megahertz, you might be able to hear people 50 kilometers away if they're using reasonable power and a beam in your direction. 28 megahertz, AM probably not. SSB maybe if you've got a good antenna and low noise, and reasonable location. 50 kilometers, you should be able to do it on 6 meters. SSB, maybe not FM. It'd get a bit marginal. Same with 2 meters. 50 kilometers, if you're in a good location, good antenna, then yep, you can do it on FM. Your chances are improved if you use SSB, as it's more efficient, and digital modes further more efficient. On 70 centimeters, 50 kilometers is probably a bit harder than on 2 meters, though it can vary. I've had contacts where of around 50 or 60 kilometers where it's been better on 70 centimeters than on 2 meters. Noise is actually a bit lower on 70 centimeters, and depending on what the other station's got, if they've got a high gain antenna, then you might get through. So yeah, that's 50 kilometers. You're not guaranteed of results, but if you've got 30, 40, 50 watts on VHF and a reasonable antenna, not too many obstructions, you might be able to work 50 kilometers between you on VHF. 100 kilometers, now you're into a territory where you're probably not going to make contact on FM unless your antenna was high, or you're up on a hill. If you're up on a hill, then 100 kilometer contacts you should be okay with, even with quite low power on VHF and UHF. But 100 kilometers, it's a funny distance. Like, it's a bit long for 160 meters ground wave during the day, but at night, 160 meters can do 100 kilometers, so can 80 meters. 40 meters would be up and down. If you've got reasonable conditions during the day, you can do 100 kilometers on 7 megahertz. I think 5 megahertz would probably still be okay during the day, 100 kilometers. At night, because of the increased noise, and you can get signals from longer distances that can overwhelm signals that are closer in. A 100 kilometer away signal might not be particularly strong, but a DX signal might be. 100 kilometers on 10, 14, 18 megahertz, probably not. Though you never know, signals can bounce all the way around the world, and you might be able to hear them. 28 megahertz, 100k is probably a bit too far under unenhanced conditions. So yeah, 100 kilometers, funny distance. You might not be able to make it on 2 meters or 70 centimeters. If you wanted to give 2 meters and 70 centimeters your best shot, you would try SSB, CW, or digital modes. And 100 kilometers, that's quite easy with quite a small Yagi on digital modes on 2 meters. 200 kilometers, again, with quite low power on digital modes on 2 meters, you can do it. On SSB, you can do it, especially if you're in a good location, but hills between you are starting to have a bigger impact. 200 kilometers, 160 meters during the day, probably not. You're probably going to be beyond ground wave coverage. 160 meters at night, yes. 630 meters, because the ground wave coverage of that is quite long, even though your antenna efficiency might not be good, if you're using a digital mode, then a band like 630 meters, I reckon, could be quite reliable for a 200 kilometer distance, day or night. 40 meters, 80 meters at night, 200 kilometers, yep, should be pretty good. You might even be able to do it during the day on 80 meters, and even on 60 meters on 5 megahertz if you've got that available, which we don't in Australia. But yeah, 200 kilometers during the day, quite possible on 5 megahertz. The higher bands like 10, 14, 21 megahertz, 200 kilometers is in those, in sort of a bit of a dead zone. Same with 28 megahertz. Although you can get short skip type conditions where occasionally you can get extremely strong signals over those sorts of distances, but pretty rare. And yeah, 200 kilometers, starting to get towards your longer distances on VHF, UHF, and microwaves, unless you've got a decent station, or you're high up, or you're using SSB. Now getting up to 300 kilometers, your best bet for a 300 kilometer contact would be at night on 80 meters. 160 meters at night would probably still be okay. If conditions are good, 40 meters during the day, 60 meters during the day should be okay for 300 kilometers. If you've got a good setup on VHF, UHF, with beams and decent towers, then SSB, 300 kilometers, you can certainly do that on 2 meters and 70 centimeters. 500 kilometers is quite hard for VHF unless conditions are enhanced. I'm not saying it's impossible. You might be able to bounce signals off aircraft and make contacts on 2 meters. SSB, they tend to be very short contacts, maybe even meteor scatter, although that's probably slightly longer distances. I haven't mentioned repeaters on VHF and UHF yet. All this depends on if you've got one that happens to be between where you are and where you want to make contact with. If you've got a handheld transceiver on 2 meters and the repeater is on a hill, then you should be able to get into that repeater, say 40, 50, maybe 60 kilometers away with that handheld transceiver. And the contacts that you make, yep, it's cheating a bit, but the contacts you make are anything that's within the range of the repeater. which might be, if it's a good, well-located repeater, it might be 50 kilometers for a handheld, maybe up to 80 or 100 kilometers for people in a vehicle, maybe a bit more for people at home that have got a good home station set up. And yeah, so I neglected mentioning repeaters before, and of course repeaters can be linked either via RF or the internet, and if you're using one of those systems, then your contacts could be worldwide, but that's sort of cheating. So the point of this video is mainly to talk about what you can make contacts directly. And we were up to 500 kilometers, so we'd covered VHF. For that frequency, for that distance, 80 meters, 3.5 megahertz at night would be good for 500 kilometers. 160 meters down at 1.8 megahertz, your signal will be weaker than if you're like 200 kilometers away, because you are relying now on skywave on 160 meters. And for that, you don't necessarily need a vertical. A horizontal dipole would be fine for skywave on a band like 160 meters and 500 kilometers. 7 megahertz, 500 kilometers during the day, unless it was very, very low solar cycle, which we've passed through. And 500 kilometers might be a bit short, but yeah, 500 kilometers during the day, you should be able to do on 7 megahertz, maybe even on 5 megahertz. 10 megahertz, probably a little bit high in frequency for 500 kilometers, but you never know, it might work depending on conditions. 21, 28 megahertz, you may be able to make 500 kilometer contacts if you're in summer and there's sporadic E, although oddly 500 kilometers is a bit less common than some further distances. I'll talk about those later on. And we've already covered VHF for 500 kilometers. When you go up to 800 kilometers, it becomes a lot harder on 160 meters. You certainly wouldn't be able to work it during the day. It would be only at night. 3.5 megahertz, again, only at night. 800 meters should be quite doable, even with low amounts of power. Then 5 megahertz, yep, 800 kilometers would be okay for that. Probably maybe around late afternoon, early evening. During the middle of the day, 800 kilometers might be a struggle at 5 megahertz. I'd normally recommend 7 megahertz. Even 10 megahertz may be in with a chance for an 800 kilometer distance during the middle of the day. You might be lucky, it could work on 14 megahertz. Now 800 kilometers, bit far for direct contacts on 2 meters or 6 meters or 70 centimeters. Unless you're using some form of enhancement. And if you were, depending on where you were, it helps if you're near the coast and you've got water between you. I should have spoken about this before, because it also works on distances less than 800 meters. But if you've got a temperature inversion, tropospheric propagation can work on VHF and UHF bands. Not so much at 6 meters or 50 megahertz, but 144 megahertz or 220 if you've got it, or 430 megahertz. Tropospheric propagation can be quite good. And here in Australia, we get it in the summer when there's a bit of an inversion, and that can really increase your distances. And not just 800 kilometers, but it could be, it could help at, say, 200 or 300 kilometer distances, even further at, say, 1,000, 2,000 or more kilometers, but they are more and more rare. So yeah, there's a possibility of tropospheric propagation and inversion on higher VHF, UHF, even microwave bands. Ionospheric propagation, sporadic E, can be good in the middle of summer for 800 to 1,000 or 1,500 kilometers, and that is, you do get it on 2 meters occasionally, but sporadic E is more common on 28 and 50 megahertz. So in summer, have a listen around those bands, and you might be able to work distances that you really cannot at other times. And when the sporadic E is really intense, then you get some shorter distances come in. So you might get 500 kilometers, maybe even 300 kilometers on 28 megahertz, but the latter is pretty rare. Now, if we keep going up in our distance to 1,000 kilometers, 160 meters, even at night, is hard. Not saying it's impossible. If you've got a good antenna, low receiving noise, you can do it. But yeah, it's hard. 80 meters is still okay at night. 60 meters should be okay at night. 40 meters, 1,000 kilometers should be pretty good during the day at both high and low sunspot periods. Though in high sunspot periods, 1,000 kilometers might be slightly longer than optimum distance. 14 megahertz, 10 megahertz during the day, that should work on 1,000 kilometers. 14 megahertz maybe. Other bands, maybe if there's a bit of short skip. And I've spoken about tropospheric and sporadic E for VHF. 1,500 kilometers, pretty much the same as 1,000. You might get some contacts on bands like 18, 21, 14 megahertz, mainly in the middle of the day. Like a distance like 1,500 kilometers on 7 megahertz, you won't necessarily get it in the middle of the day. There have been times when I have, but most often not. But if you just give it a couple of hours, so instead of being in the middle of the day, maybe 4 p.m. or 5 p.m., a couple of hours before dusk, then 1,000 or 1,500 kilometers will be quite doable on 7 megahertz. If you are wanting to try in the middle of the day, then go up a higher band like 10 megahertz or 14 megahertz for a 1,500 kilometer distance. You might be lucky and 28 megahertz might even be open, depending on solar activity. And 1,500 is the sort of distance that meteor scatter could work on bands like 28 and 50 megahertz. And some people even try it on 144 with some success. 2,000 kilometers, now that gets a bit harder for 3.5 megahertz at night. You can still do it. With QRP, you won't be able to do it all the time you operate. Even with 100 watts, 2,000 kilometers can be quite difficult. But yeah, it's the sort of distance that, again, it's a bit far for 7 megahertz during the day, but again, it's the sort of distance that around just after sunrise, if you're trying to talk to people to the west, because it will still be dark in the west and it will be a bit light over where you are. And you might be able to get your 2,000 or 3,000 kilometer contacts on 7 megahertz. If you're trying to make contact with people that are east of you, then try in the evening because it will be already dark over where they are. And for direct north-south, then you're both going to be pretty much on the grey line. So around dusk for around 2,000 kilometers on 7 megahertz. 10 megahertz I think would be quite good for that distance. Maybe even in the middle of the day, but it might be better late morning, early afternoon than exactly at noon. Depends on propagation a lot. But 10 should be easier during the day than 7 megahertz. You should be able to get contacts on that distance of 2,000 kilometers on 14, 18 megahertz as well. Maybe even if you're lucky, 28 and 50 megahertz only if they're sporadic E. 3 and 4,000 kilometers, it becomes a real struggle on 3.5 megahertz, but you could still do it at night. 7 megahertz a bit easier. 10 and 14 probably about the best bands for 3 or 4,000 kilometers. It does depend on the time of day as well. And propagation can be volatile, but you might get it on 21, 28 meg also. When you go up to something like 8,000 kilometers, now that's, getting to the DX realm. I think that's from Australia. It's like Japan. It might be a struggle on 3.5 megahertz. It would only be at night. Same with 7 megahertz. A bit easier on 7 megahertz than 3.5. 10 megahertz is certainly a possibility. 14 megahertz might be at night during a high solar cycle period. Otherwise, late afternoon. In the middle of the day, 21 megahertz, 18, 21, maybe 24 megahertz, that could work for 8,000 kilometers. Directly north-south, the frequencies are normally open longer, or higher frequencies are normally open for a direct north-south path than an east-west path. So there are a lot of times when say 21 or 28 megahertz might be open to Japan, but for other, for 14 megahertz, then you might need 14 megahertz for longer distance east-west type contacts. 8,000 kilometers, it is a long way. VHF would be a struggle, but there can be some interesting propagation modes, like combinations of ionospheric and sporadic E at one end and 6 meters. People have worked. It's quite common when conditions are good to be working Japanese stations on 50 megahertz, and then you've got stuff like transequatorial propagation can come into it as well. When you go up to your 12,000 and 20,000 kilometers, then yeah, you can work those distances on 160 meters. A real struggle. Most people don't bother. They've got too much noise or require good antennas. You can on 3.5, but your 12,000 to 20,000 kilometers, they are easiest on your DX band. So between 10 and 21 megahertz, 28 megahertz if conditions are good. Very roughly, your higher HF bands are better during the day, lower HF bands better at night. There's various propagation charts, there's software that you can look at HF predictions for various parts of the world at your longer distances. And at your longer distances, you can also have what they call long path, like the radio signal that's best for propagation isn't necessarily the short way around. Like if we're making contact in Europe, here in Australia in the late afternoon, often long path on 14 megahertz is better. So we've actually got to beam our antennas, if we do have a beam, the other way to what you might think is the shortest way to Europe. So yeah, long path, like a few hours before sunset on 14 megahertz, is pretty reliable towards Europe on 14 meg. Then you've got stuff like grey line, and it's important for signals. If signals follow the grey line, you've got enhancement, and the grey line is the part that's basically on sunrise or sunset. So it's the line on one side, it's daylight, the other, it's night. I should also mention on VHF, UHF, there's also the possibility of satellite communication. And yeah, with satellites, your range depends on the footprint. You've got to be line of sight to the satellite, so does the other guy. If satellites are on a higher orbit, we don't have geostationary amateur satellites accessible in Australia. I think there might be one or two that's accessible over Europe, but our satellites are generally low Earth orbiting, and the satellite's footprint might be, say, 3,000 kilometers. So if you've got a low Earth orbiting satellite, it's good because it's close to Earth. You could just use a handheld transceiver to get into it. Then for a short time, you might have contacts of 2,000 or 3,000 kilometers via that satellite. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I've covered distances from 1,000 kilometers to worldwide and most others in between. Let me know in the comments what you think. It's been a long video. I make no apologies for it because there is a lot to cover. But yeah, if you've ever wanted to ask the question, my friend lives, say, 300 kilometers away, what's the best frequency? Well, if you stop this video, go back to where I covered 300 kilometers. Hopefully there's a few tips that are useful for you. Now, for more information on antennas with this sort of stuff, especially if you're into portable QRP, then check out my ebooks, Hand-Carried QRP Antennas and More Hand-Carried QRP Antennas. You can get them on Amazon, or you can search my website at vk3ye.com. Or if you're interested more in the operating side, especially with low power, then my book Minimum QRP is the one you need. Again, available via Amazon, either as an ebook or paperback. Thanks a lot, and I'd appreciate your comments at the end on the bands that you find best for certain distances.